It only took 47 words. That's all it took. Just 47 carefully chosen words, posted at 9:30 in the morning, and in an instant, the President of the United States had declared that Canada, America's single largest trading partner, was essentially banned from doing business. This wasn't some incremental tariff increase designed to pressure negotiations, nor was it a stern diplomatic warning delivered through official channels. No, this was a full-on ban, a complete shutdown. In one solitary social media post, Donald Trump laid it out plainly. A total suspension of all non-essential trade and travel between the United States and Canada, set to kick in after just 72 hours, unless Canada immediately signed on to a new framework agreement. Let that truly sink in for a moment. Absorb the sheer magnitude of what that means. We're talking about $2 billion in commerce flowing across that shared border every single day, goods and services moving seamlessly in a rhythm that powers economies on both sides. 9 million American jobs are tied directly or indirectly to that intricate relationship, from factory workers in the Midwest assembling parts sourced from Ontario to tech specialists in Seattle collaborating with teams in Vancouver. And this isn't some fragile, recent arrangement. It's 70 years of deep economic integration, painstakingly built and fortified through the chaos of world wars, the high-stakes tensions of the Cold War, repeated financial crises that shook global markets, and even the unprecedented disruptions of a global pandemic. Through all those monumental challenges, battles, ideological standoffs, economic meltdowns, and health emergencies, not one of them ever halted U.S.-Canada trade for even a single day. The border stayed open, commerce persisted because the foundation was that solid, that essential. And yet now, based solely on one impulsive social media post, it was all supposed to come grinding to a screeching halt within 3 short days. The audacity of it, the suddenness, it's the kind of move that upends expectations and forces everyone to recalibrate. But here's where the story takes a truly dramatic turn, shifting from a unilateral declaration into a high-stakes, real-time confrontation playing out on the world stage. At the exact moment that tweet went live, sparking notifications across phones and screens globally, Canada's Prime Minister Mark Carney was already positioned at a podium in Ottawa, conducting a live press conference that was being broadcast across multiple international networks. Think about the setup. CBC capturing every word for domestic audiences, BBC World relaying it to Europe and beyond, Reuters feeding it into wire services, CNN International beaming it to viewers in the US and elsewhere, every camera already rolling, every microphone hot, the event unfolding in real time without the buffer of editing or delays. Then, amid the questions and answers, a journalist's phone buzzed with an alert. She glanced down, processed the information, and raised her hand. In a room crammed full of reporters with cameras broadcasting the scene to the entire world, she proceeded to read the tweet out loud, verbatim, her voice cutting through the air like a sudden thunderclap. The room fell into an eerie silence, the kind where you can almost hear hearts pounding. Every lens in the place swiveled toward the podium, zooming in on the Prime Minister's face. And just like that, with no warning, no preparation time, the Prime Minister of Canada had about 4 seconds, 4 fleeting seconds, to decide how to respond to a sitting U.S. president who had just publicly announced on social media that his entire country had effectively been banned from economic engagement. The weight of that moment can't be overstated. It's the stuff of political thrillers. But this was real, with global implications hanging in the balance. For a brief, tension-filled moment, the entire room seemed to freeze in place, suspended in uncertainty. No aides rushed forward with notes or advice. No one whispered a quick briefing into his ear. There was no convenient commercial break to buy time or regroup. Just a prime minister standing alone at a podium while the world watched in unfiltered real time. Cameras zoomed in tighter, capturing every micro-expression, every subtle shift. Reporters leaned forward in their seats, pens poised, senses heightened. And then Mark Carney took one slow, deliberate breath, the kind of breath you only see from someone who has spent years navigating the treacherous waters of financial crises. From his time steering the Bank of Canada through economic turmoil to advising on global stability. It's that rare kind of calm, a composed demeanor that signals to jittery markets and watchful governments alike that panic is simply not part of the equation, that reason and procedure will prevail over chaos. Then, with the poise of a seasoned leader, he looked straight at the cameras, locking eyes with the invisible audience of millions, and began to speak. "I've seen the post," he said, his voice steady and measured, betraying no hint of surprise or agitation. "Let me respond directly." The room tightened even further, a collective intake of breath as everyone braced for what came next. Every microphone in the place captured the following sentence, the one that would instantly echo around the world, reverberating through newsrooms, boardrooms, and living rooms alike. "A tweet," Carney said, "is not a law." Just like that, simple, direct, no anger flaring up, no theatrics to amp up the drama, just a calm, almost surgical explanation that cut right to the heart of the matter. He continued, building on that foundation, making the point unmistakably clear with the precision of a legal scholar dissecting a case. "A social media post," he elaborated, "does not constitute a legal instrument under American domestic law. It's not a bill passed by Congress, not a regulation issued by an agency, nothing that carries the force of governance. It is not binding under international treaty law, where agreements like the USMCA demand formal notifications and adherence to protocols established over decades. And it certainly does not qualify as an enforceable action under the rules of the World Trade Organization, which governs global commerce with strict guidelines on what counts as a valid trade restriction. Canada," he explained in clear terms, "would not be responding to a tweet as if it were an official decree. That would undermine the very structures of international relations. Instead, Canada would respond only to a formal legal instrument transmitted through proper diplomatic channels, if indeed one ever materialized." The clarity of that stance was like a beacon in the fog, grounding the situation in facts rather than frenzy. A second reporter, sensing the gravity, quickly jumped in to probe deeper. "Prime Minister, are you saying Canada is simply ignoring the President of the United States?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, loaded with implications about defiance and international decorum. Carney didn't hesitate for even a beat. He turned toward the reporter and answered with the same calm precision that had defined his initial response. "Canada applies the same standard to communications from any government," he said, emphasizing the universality of the approach to avoid any perception of bias. "If it carries legal standing, backed by statutes, signatures, and seals, we respond formally, with the full weight of our diplomatic apparatus. If it does not, we acknowledge it as a statement, note its contents, and we continue governing as usual, focused on the priorities of our citizens." And with that single resolute statement broadcast live across international television feeds, Canada made its position crystal clear, broadcasting a message of steadfast adherence to rules amid uncertainty. The tweet might dominate social media headlines, trending worldwide and sparking endless threads of speculation and outrage. But in Ottawa, the government was treating it as political noise, not a binding directive, not law, but mere rhetoric amplified by algorithms. What happened next, however, proved that the world's financial markets were paying extremely close attention, far beyond the chatter of online debates. Within minutes, the reaction began to unfold, and it didn't start on cable news panels where pundits dissect every angle for hours. No, it started on Wall Street trading floors, in the fast-paced currency markets, and inside the glowing screens of trading terminals scattered around the world from Tokyo to London. Because professional traders, the ones moving billions in assets, don't wait for talking heads to explain what just happened or spin narratives. They watch the signals in real time, interpret them through the lens of risk and reality, and then they price the situation accordingly, adjusting positions with lightning speed. And the signals coming out of that live broadcast from Ottawa were impossible to ignore. They were clear, authoritative, and grounded in legal reasoning. Within 20 minutes of Carney's response circulating across financial news networks like Bloomberg and CNBC, the US dollar dropped roughly 1.3% against a basket of major currencies. a dip that reflected eroding confidence in the greenback's stability amid the uncertainty. Gold surged upward as investors flocked to safe haven assets, seeking refuge from potential volatility. Treasury yields shifted noticeably, with bond prices adjusting to new expectations of economic friction. The markets weren't simply reacting to political drama or headline hype. They were reacting to something much more precise, much more fundamental, a glaring gap between a presidential declaration and the legal authority required to enforce it. In other words, markets recognized two completely different messages emerging from the same story, clashing like opposing forces. On one side, a U.S. president had issued a sweeping economic threat through a social media post with no statute cited to back it up, no executive order referenced, and no formal emergency declaration to lend it weight. It was bold but bare. On the other side, a G7 prime minister had calmly explained, live on international television, that such a post had no legal standing under American law, under international treaty law, or under the rules governing global trade through bodies like the WTO. When those two signals collide in real time, financial markets don't hesitate or debate. They evaluate which one carries actual legal credibility, which one aligns with enforceable reality, and they move accordingly, reallocating capital in ways that can reshape economies. And the reaction spread fast, rippling outward like waves from a stone thrown into a pond. Within 40 minutes, finance ministers from 3 major G7 countries, Germany, France, and Japan, had already contacted Ottawa through secure channels. Diplomatic sources later described the message as remarkably consistent across the board, a unified front in a moment of flux. Canada, they affirmed, held the legal high ground, standing firm on principles that protect the global order. The rules-based trade system mattered profoundly, they stressed, as it underpins prosperity for all nations involved. And Canada's decision to treat the tweet as legally meaningless was the correct procedural response, a model of how to handle such disruptions without escalating into chaos. Meanwhile, in London, the British Foreign Secretary issued a public statement that echoed these sentiments, calling the situation deeply concerning in its potential to unsettle long-standing alliances, while reaffirming support for the international trading system that the United States itself had helped build and champion decades ago, from the post-World War II era onward. And before the morning was even over, before coffee breaks in North America had wrapped up, the European Union's Trade Commissioner had convened an emergency coordination call with counterparts from Japan, South Korea, Australia, and New Zealand, pulling together a coalition of key players in record time. Think about that for a second. Let it really register. These were not adversaries mobilizing against the United States in some adversarial bloc. These were long-standing American allies. Nations bound by defense pacts, shared values, and mutual economic interests, scrambling to understand and respond to an economic threat announced by Washington itself, a self-inflicted wound that raised questions about reliability and predictability. And this is where the legal reality begins to hit like a brick wall, unyielding and immovable, because under American law, a presidential tweet, no matter how dramatic or widely shared, has absolutely no legal effect by itself. It isn't an executive order, which requires drafting, review, and publication in the Federal Register. It isn't a presidential proclamation, which must cite specific authorities and follow procedural norms. It isn't a national emergency declaration, which triggers congressional oversight and potential termination. It isn't even a formal diplomatic communication, like a démarche delivered through embassies. In other words, posting on social media does not suddenly grant the authority to shut down the largest trading relationship on the planet, a bilateral flow that dwarfs many others in scale and importance. For something on that scale to actually happen, to disrupt supply chains, halt shipments, and close borders, the president must invoke specific statutory powers, follow meticulously outlined legal procedures, and issue a formal instrument that can withstand scrutiny from multiple angles. Domestic courts ready to hear challenges, Congress with its oversight role, and international agreements that bind the U.S. to fair play. And that's where the situation becomes extremely complicated for the White House, tangled in a web of requirements that can't be bypassed with a quick post. The tools that exist for a president to restrict trade all come with strict legal requirements designed to prevent arbitrary actions that could harm the economy or alliances. The International Emergency Economic Powers Act, for example, requires a formal declaration of a national emergency, a public documented step, and a clear finding that a foreign country poses an unusual and extraordinary threat to U.S. national security, foreign policy, or the American economy. Imagine the legal storm that would follow if a U.S. president suddenly declared Canada a fellow NATO ally sharing military intelligence and joint operations, a NORAD partner defending North American airspace together, and the nation connected by the longest peaceful border on Earth to be such a threat. It would strain credulity, inviting mockery and skepticism. Constitutional scholars say such a move would almost certainly trigger immediate lawsuits in federal court, with plaintiffs ranging from affected businesses to states bordering Canada, and it could be blocked by injunctions before it ever took effect, freezing the action in legal limbo. Other trade authorities aren't any easier to wield, each layered with safeguards to ensure deliberation over haste. Section 232 of the Trade Expansion Act allows tariffs in the name of national security, but it requires a lengthy investigation process conducted by the Department of Commerce, complete with public hearings, reports, and findings that must hold up to review. Months of work, not a snap decision. Section 301 of the Trade Act of 1974 also demands formal findings of unfair practices, procedural steps involving consultations and notifications, and timelines that stretch into months, not a mere 72 hours. In short, there was no clean, straightforward legal pathway for the sweeping ban described in the tweet. Every route was obstructed by checks and balances built into the system. Harvard constitutional law professor Lawrence Tribe, a respected voice in legal circles, went on television later that afternoon and put it bluntly, distilling the complexity into a stark truth. A trade ban announced through a social media post without citing legal authority has precisely zero legal effect until it becomes a formal government action, backed by the necessary instruments and processes. And that left the administration facing a dilemma that was both political and constitutional, a fork in the road where every direction led to pitfalls, and neither option looked good, each carrying the risk of undermining credibility or inviting backlash. And that dilemma is now sitting right in the center of a 72-hour countdown, a ticking clock that amplifies the pressure with every passing minute. Because the moment that tweet was posted, the clock started ticking relentlessly, and the administration suddenly found itself trapped between two outcomes that both carry serious consequences, neither offering an easy escape. If the White House follows through and issues a formal executive order to enforce the ban, it must choose a legal authority to justify it, picking from the limited toolkit available and hoping it sticks. The moment that authority is cited and made public, federal courts will examine it closely, with judges applying rigorous standards to assess validity. Legal challenges will appear almost instantly, filed by a coalition of stakeholders, Canadian officials invoking treaty rights, U.S. businesses arguing economic harm, advocacy groups citing constitutional overreach. That means a federal judge could end up publicly ruling on the limits of presidential trade power, issuing opinions that dissect the action's legality in detail. For any administration that prides itself on projecting strength and dominance, on being seen as decisive and unchallenged, the image of a court blocking its signature move, halting the ban with an injunction, would be politically devastating, a visible setback that opponents could exploit for years. But the other path may be just as damaging, eroding authority in a different but equally profound way. If the 72 hours expire and no formal legal instrument appears, no executive order drafted and signed, no emergency declaration proclaimed, no congressional action mobilized to provide cover, then the conclusion becomes unavoidable, stark, and undeniable. The tweet accomplished nothing tangible. It was all bluster without bite. The ban never legally existed, never moved beyond words on a screen. And the statement Mark Carney made on live international television that a tweet is not a law will be remembered as the pivotal moment when the gap between political messaging and actual legal authority was exposed for the entire world to see, a revelation that demystifies power and highlights its boundaries. That precedent doesn't disappear when the news cycle ends or when attention shifts to the next scandal. It lingers like a shadow, influencing future interactions. Governments remember it, filing it away in diplomatic playbooks for how to handle similar situations. Markets remember it, incorporating it into risk assessments and trading algorithms that factor in the reliability of announcements. And the next time any American administration threatens economic action through social media alone, without the backing of formal processes, every finance ministry on earth will remember what happened here, pausing to verify before reacting, potentially diminishing the impact of such threats. Meanwhile, Canada has continued moving forward with its strategy, undeterred and proactive in the face of uncertainty. Trade disputes are already advancing through the established USMCA legal system, with panels reviewing claims and counterclaims in an orderly fashion designed to resolve issues fairly. Energy partnerships with Europe are expanding steadily, with new agreements on pipelines and renewables bolstering alternatives to US-centric flows. Supply chains are being redirected toward trusted allies in Asia, diversifying routes to mitigate risks and ensure continuity. At every escalation in this confrontation, from the initial post to the market ripples, Canada has responded faster, more precisely, and with stronger legal footing than Washington expected, turning potential vulnerabilities into demonstrations of resilience. This isn't improvisation born of desperation. It's preparation honed over years of scenario planning, diplomatic training, and economic modeling. And that preparation has allowed Canada to face down a presidential threat head-on, calmly explain why it carried no legal force in a way that resonated globally, and continue governing without blinking, maintaining focus on domestic priorities like jobs, healthcare, and innovation. Now, the world is watching the clock with bated breath, every tick amplifying the suspense as the deadline approaches. When that 72-hour deadline finally arrives, marking the end of the ultimatum laid out in those 47 words, one simple yet profound question will be answered definitively, shaping perceptions for generations. Was that tweet the beginning of a historic trade confrontation, a clash that could redefine North American relations and ripple through global economies? Or was it the moment the limits of presidential power were revealed in front of the entire world? A stark reminder that in a system of laws, not all declarations carry equal weight. And true authority demands more than a post. It requires substance, procedure, and accountability. The outcome will echo far beyond borders, influencing how leaders communicate, how markets respond, and how nations navigate the delicate balance between rhetoric and reality in an interconnected age.